Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are wrestling with, well, one of history's most fiercely debated figures, Christopher Columbus.
Definitely. We're talking about a man whose story is just so central, isn't it?
Yeah.
To the modern world, really.
Absolutely. But his historical perception has just swung so wildly. I mean, from this heroic, almost mythical pioneer.
Right. The discoverer.
To now an undeniable symbol of, well, catastrophic colonial impact.
And that paradox is really what we're diving into today. It's the engine, you could say. For millions, his name is that hinge point, isn't it?
Yeah.
The start of the Age of Discovery, the end of the pre-Columbian world. But for millions more, he represents the starting gun for, centuries of exploitation, forced labor, devastating depopulation.
It's hard to think of another figure whose legacy is so split down the middle,
Yeah.
where the hero and the villain are basically the same person.
Exactly. It's that same identity.
So our mission today is to trace that really complex journey. We're going to use the sources we've gathered to look at everything.
From his obscure origins, his ambitious but ultimately flawed ideas.
Right, through those 4 world-changing voyages he led.
And then finally, we have to examine the incredibly harsh, the brutal legacy he left behind.
By the end, we hope we can give you a clearer picture, maybe, of this admiral of paradox.
And we should probably start right at the beginning, which is surprisingly quite murky. It forces us right away to deal with these complexities around who he actually was.
Absolutely. I think the first identity shock for a lot of people is that he wasn't Spanish. Even though he sailed for Spain for the Crown of Castile, he was an Italian explorer, a navigator, generally believed to be from the Republic of Genoa, born around 1451.
And his background was pretty modest, which makes his eventual achievements and just the sheer scale of his ambition even more remarkable when you think about it. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a wool weaver. Also ran a cheese stand on the side, apparently, which young Christopher even worked at.
A cheese stand?
Yeah. And his mother was Susanna Fontanarossa. Now, while most scholars, the vast majority, accept the Genoese origin, the sources do mention these persistent, though mostly discounted theories that he might have come from Aragon and Spain, or maybe even Portugal.
So it just highlights how difficult it is, centuries later, to nail down the specific.
Yeah, confirming biographical details is a real challenge.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this journey. From a wool weaver's son working a cheese stand to admiral of the ocean sea. How does that happen?
Well, the sources suggest he left the family trade for the sea incredibly early.
How early?
Just 14 years old.
14.
Yeah. And he didn't just stick to the Mediterranean. His early sea life was extensive. It gave him this truly Atlantic-wide education in seamanship, in trade.
So where did he go?
He traveled far north, reached the British Isles. Records suggest Bristol, Galway, and Ireland.
Okay.
Some accounts even put him in Iceland around 1477, although that's pretty hotly debated.
Iceland. That's quite a trip.
And crucially, he also sailed south, down the West African coast, reaching the Portuguese trading post of Elmina. That's in modern-day Ghana.
Why is that contrast so important? Sailing north to maybe Iceland and south to Ghana. What did that give him?
It gave him invaluable practical knowledge of the entire Atlantic wind system. Navigating north taught him about the westerlies, the North Atlantic weather.
Right.
Sailing the West African coast exposed him directly to the Canary Current, the trade winds.
The very winds he'd later use.
Precisely. The system of currents and winds he exploited to get to the Caribbean, and critically, to get back. He understood the practical physics of the ocean, probably better than many of the academics who later dismissed his ideas.
He definitely wasn't educated in a traditional sense, like at a university or a royal court.
No.
Which brings us to his self-education. He must have been incredibly driven to teach himself what he needed to devise such an audacious plan.
He absolutely was. He taught himself Latin, Portuguese, Castilian, specifically so he could access the key texts. He basically created his own curriculum, didn't he? Studying the big works in cosmography, astronomy, history, he pored over Ptolemy's geography, Marco Polo's travels, Pliny's natural history.
Any particular favorites?
Especially Pierre Daly's Imago Mundi. He was laser-focused, accumulating knowledge to back up this one single overriding vision he had.
But as you said, reading those sources didn't necessarily make him a meticulous scholar. There's that quote from the historian Edmund Morgan.
Ah, yes, that his ideas were simple and strong and sometimes wrong.
It's fascinating, isn't it, that his greatest strength, that singular focus, was maybe also his greatest intellectual weakness.
It perfectly captures the paradox of the man. And while he was formulating this grand plan, he was living in Lisbon between about 1477 and 1485.
Doing what?
Working as a cartographer, actually, alongside his brother Bartholomew. This is also when he started his family. He married Filipa Moniz Perestrelo, a Portuguese noblewoman.
Right.
She bore his first son, Diego. Then after she died, he moved to Castile in Spain. And there he started a relationship with his Castilian mistress, Beatriz Enriquez de Arana.
And she was the mother of his second son.
Fernando, yes. So his personal life is really tangled up with his professional lobbying efforts in these two powerful kingdoms, Portugal and Spain.
And the grand idea, the one that obsessed him, sounds simple on the surface. Find a westward sea route to the East Indies. Get access to that incredibly lucrative spice trade.
Simple on the surface, yes. But the sources really stress this wasn't just about money, about commerce. It was fueled by this intense, almost fanatical religious zeal.
How so? What do they suggest?
Well, commentators argue Columbus was deeply motivated by Christian millennialist beliefs. Apocalyptic ideas, even.
So not just silk and pepper.
Not at all. His own writings reveal a mission that went way beyond trade. He repeatedly said his goal was to acquire gold in such quantity that the sovereigns will undertake and prepare to go conquer the Holy Sepulchre.
Wow. So he saw finding a western route as part of a divine mission.
Exactly. Intrinsically linked to financing a final crusade, fulfilling biblical prophecy before, the end times.
That context really transforms him, doesn't it? From maybe a savvy entrepreneur into this driven, almost crusading figure. It adds this whole layer of intense ambition, maybe fanaticism, to his pitch.
It certainly does.
Okay, let's get to the core of that pitch, because this is where his ideas being sometimes wrong, as Morgan put it, almost guaranteed his failure, or should have.
This is what we could call the theory of error. And it's absolutely critical to understanding his story. We have to start by busting that old myth.
The flat earth myth.
Exactly. Educated people in the 15th century knew the earth was a sphere. That wasn't the debate. That had been understood since antiquity.
So the issue wasn't the shape, it was the size.
The size of the Earth, yes. And crucially, the size of the ocean separating Europe from Asia to the West. That was the problem.
So his error was basically mathematical, based on old texts, maybe bad conversions, not ignorance of basic cosmology.
Precisely.
So where did he go so wrong in his maths?
Well, he made a whole cascade of critical mistakes. First, he relied on older, smaller units of distance, mainly from Ptolemy, and he drastically underestimated the Earth's circumference. By about a third.
A third. That's huge.
Massive. Second, he seriously misinterpreted the Arabic mile used by the 9th century astronomer Alfraganus. He thought the Arabic mile, which is about 1,830 meters, was the same as the much shorter Roman mile, which is only around 400 and 480 meters.
Oh, okay. So by using the wrong conversion factor for that key unit, he basically shrunk the whole planet in his calculations.
Pretty much, yeah. That mistake alone led him to estimate the Earth's circumference at maybe 75% of Eratosthenes' calculation, which was actually known and generally accepted by scholars at the time.
And there was a third error, too.
Yes, he wildly overestimated the east-west span of the Eurasian landmass. Most people accepted Ptolemy's estimate of 180 degrees of longitude, but Columbus inflated that, citing an earlier geographer, Marinus of Tyre, who put Eurasia at 225 degrees.
So if Eurasia stretched 225 degrees around the globe in his mind.
Exactly. Then the vast Pacific Ocean just didn't exist for him. The ocean gap between Europe and Japan had to be tiny.
Shockingly small, based on his numbers.
And to compound it all, he leaned heavily on Marco Polo's claim, probably exaggerated, that Japan, or Cipangu, was about 1,500 miles east of China.
So you add it all up. Underestimated circumference, wrong mile unit, overestimated landmass, Japan supposedly close.
It was a perfect storm of errors.
Yep.
Based on all that, Columbus calculated the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan as only 2,400 nautical miles.
Okay, let's just pause on that number. 2,400 nautical miles, that's what he promised the Spanish crown he could sail.
Right.
But the actual distance from the Canaries to Japan?
It's over 10,600 nautical miles.
More than 4 times further.
And that difference is the absolute crux of the story. It explains why every serious navigator and expert, especially the Portuguese, thought his plan was impossible. Reckless, even.
Because no ship back then could possibly carry enough food and water for a 10,600 nautical mile journey across open ocean.
Impossible.
Yeah.
His success depended entirely on an intermediate landmass, the Americas being right there, exactly where it happened to be. He needed something to bump into.
His certainty, though, in this totally flawed math, combined with the fact he was pitching this while Spain was fighting that expensive Granada War, it meant he wasn't exactly an attractive prospect for a long time.
No, he faced multiple rejections. Portugal, which was the leading maritime power, just rejected his plan outright.
Why?
Their experts had solid geographical reasons to think his distances were way off. Plus, Bartolomeu Dias had just successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488.
Ah, so Portugal already had a viable sea route to Asia?
They did. A confirmed and significantly safer route. It made Columbus's risky Western gamble look completely unnecessary for them.
So that rejection basically pushed him fully towards Castile, towards Spain, where he spent years just relentlessly lobbying Ferdinand and Isabella.
He was practically a fixture at their court, apparently, waiting until they finally finished the Reconquista, conquered Granada in January 1492.
His persistence paid off, but only just right, at the very last minute.
It seems so. A royal council initially found his proposal implausible, just like the Portuguese had. It really took the intervention of the king's finance minister, Luis de Santongo.
What did he see in it?
He saw the potential reward versus the relatively low cost just 3 ships. And maybe a final appeal to Queen Isabella, who perhaps feared Columbus might take his ideas to France or England. That finally sealed the deal.
And what a deal it was. The capitulations of Santa Fe, signed in April 1492, the rewards promised if he succeeded were just staggering, extravagant.
Absolutely unprecedented. The contract was based on the belief they were potentially dealing with the leader of a new, incredibly lucrative trade empire. He was promised the hereditary title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea.
Hereditary?
Yes, and appointed viceroy and governor of all new lands he claimed for Spain.
That's huge enough, but the financial terms were something else entirely.
They were seismic. He was entitled to a 1/10 share, the diezmo of all revenues, gold, pearls, spices, any merchandise from the new lands.
Forever.
Perpetually. And he had the option to buy an 1/8 interest in any commercial venture coming out of those lands and receive an 1/8 of the profits.
You can see why they might want to back out later.
Exactly. The sheer scope of that commitment, tying the crown to Columbus and his heirs forever, is why Ferdinand and Isabella later spent years trying to wriggle out of it. It led to those long, bitter legal battles fought by his family, the Pleitos Colombinos.
So the lobbying finally worked, the deal was struck, and the transition to action was immediate. Let's move to the voyages themselves. The first voyage, 1492, is iconic. But the sources give us some critical details about his mindset right after landfall that kind of signal the violence that was to come.
The voyage kicked off August 3rd, 1492. The Santa Maria, Pinta, and Nina. After a stop for repairs in the Canaries, they set off properly on September 6th.
Must have been terrifying for the crew, sailing into the unknown for so long.
Oh, absolutely. The sources mention near mutiny because the distance seemed impossible. But they finally made landfall on October 12th, 1492, an island the natives called Guanahani.
Which Columbus immediately renamed.
Renamed San Salvador, in the Bahamas. And his initial encounter, right away, establishes those Eurocentric colonial assumptions.
How so?
He immediately called the local people the Lucayan, Taíno, Arawak, Los Indios, Indians, because he was utterly convinced he'd reached the East Indies.
And he maintained that conviction his whole life, didn't he?
Pretty much, yeah. He noted their simplicity, their generosity, their lack of weapons, and crucially, he wrote in his journal they should be good and intelligent servants.
Chilling.
And he even boasted chillingly that he could conquer the entire population with just 50 men.
He was also immediately focused on gold, wasn't he? Taking prisoners, demanding they lead him to treasure.
Correct. After exploring parts of Cuba and Hispaniola, that's Haiti and the Dominican Republic today, the flagship, the Santa Maria, wrecked. On Christmas Day, 1492.
What did he do?
He used the ship's timbers to build the first European settlement, La Navidad, in present-day Haiti.
Yeah.
Left 39 men behind. Then he sailed back to Spain, a hero, early 1493.
Bringing back samples?
Samples of plants, animals, and significantly captured Taíno people. Only one of whom, a young Lucayan boy he adopted, named Diego, apparently survived the journey and the diseases long enough to be, well, useful later.
The greatest irony, though, is that persistent misconception. He never really backed down from the idea he'd reached Asia.
His intellectual stubbornness on that point was profound. He maintained until his death that Cuba was the east coast of Asia.
And some sources suggest that might be why America isn't named after him.
It's a strong possibility, yeah.
Yeah.
That his refusal to accept it was a new world might explain why Amerigo Vespucci, who did recognize it as a distinct continent, got the naming honor, even when Columbus landed on mainland South America on his third voyage.
Venezuela, right.
The Praia Peninsula. He realized it must be a continent but he still tried to rationalize it as like the location of the earthly paradise at the end of the Orient.
Yeah.
He just couldn't let go of the Asia idea.
Okay, the second voyage, launched in 1493. This seems to mark a definitive shift, doesn't it? From exploration more towards brutal colonial administration.
Oh, absolutely. This was a massive undertaking compared to the first. 17 ships, nearly 1,500 men, soldiers, priests, farmers, artisans.
What was the mission?
Explicitly establish permanent colonies, secure Spanish claims, and find gold. They founded La Isabela in the Dominican Republic.
And the shift to violence seems to have started almost immediately upon his return to La Navidad, where he'd left those 39 men.
That's right. He found them all dead. The settlement burned to the ground.
What happened?
He learned the Spaniards he'd left behind had basically run amok, quarreling, stealing gold, seizing native women. They provoked a local chief, a cacique named Caonabo, into retaliating.
How did Columbus react to that? Did he blame his men?
Not really. What's crucial is he didn't seem to internalize any blame or reflect on his men's conduct. He immediately externalized the problem onto the Taino people.
So he escalated the conflict.
Dramatically. He assembled a large armed force, cavalry, hunting dogs, and waged war on the native population until they surrendered and agreed to pay tribute, usually gold.
And this is where we see the start of those institutionalized systems of oppression, the ones that defined Spanish colonization for decades.
Exactly. This is where the encomiendas system really gets implemented under his administration.
Can you explain that briefly?
It was essentially a Spanish labor system. It rewarded conquerors with the forced unpaid labor of the conquered non-Christian peoples. In theory, the Spanish holder, the encomendero, was supposed to protect the natives and instruct them in Christianity, but in practice,
It was brutal exploitation.
it was. The documentation from this period shows horrifying, systemic cruelty used to enforce it. Whippings, mutilation, attack dogs were common punishments for both Spaniards who stepped out of line and far more often for the native people.
Was there any pushback from his own men or the priests who were there, or was this tyranny just accepted?
Well, the sources show the brutality was initially enforced by Columbus and his brothers Bartholomew and Diego, but the system itself actually led to conflict among the Spaniards too, fighting over control of land and native labor.
Oh.
The Crown eventually stepped in, partly because of the administrative chaos and the sheer volume of complaints from Spaniards who felt Columbus and his brothers were running a tyrannical operation, even towards them. But the systemic violence against the indigenous population, that was largely unopposed by the colonists, many of whom got rich very quickly from it.
And the scale of actual enslavement, sending people back to Spain?
Immediate and massive. In February 1495, Columbus rounded up about 1,500 Arawaks. He picked 500 of the strongest, shipped them to Spain to be sold as slaves.
How many survived the journey?
A staggering 200 died en route. Disease, starvation, the appalling conditions on the ships. And for those who remained in Hispaniola, routine beatings, rape, torture for information about gold. It got so bad that contemporary sources mention thousands of indigenous people committing mass suicide rather than face the oppression and the impossible tribute demands.
It is incredibly difficult to reconcile the image of the ambitious navigator from the first voyage with this tyrannical governor documented during the second.
It is. And this mismanagement, this cruelty became so severe, so widely reported, that it led directly to his downfall during the third voyage.
The complaints reached Spain.
They grew loud enough that the crown just couldn't ignore them anymore. So in 1500, during that third voyage, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand sent out a royal commissioner, Francisco de Bobadilla, to investigate how Hispaniola was being governed. And
Bobadilla's report survived.
Yes, it was lost for centuries, but rediscovered relatively recently. It provides this chilling, unvarnished view of Columbus's administration, backed up by numerous eyewitness accounts collected by Bobadilla.
What kind of specific allegations did it contain?
Shocking ones. They speak to a deliberate use of terror to maintain control. The report stated Columbus once punished a man found guilty of stealing corn by having his ears and nose cut off and then selling him into slavery.
Good Lord.
There's also testimony alleging that his brother Bartholomew ordered a pregnant Taino noblewoman paraded naked through the streets and then had her tongue cut out, simply for speaking ill of the admiral and his brothers.
And the crown acted on these accusations.
They took them very seriously. Bobadilla had Columbus arrested immediately, put him in chains, famously, aboard the ship La Gorda, and sent him back to Spain in disgrace in October 1500.
How could the crown justify that? After giving him those incredible titles, those perpetual rewards, arresting their own admiral and viceroy.
They justified it through his sheer incompetence as an administrator and the severity of the alleged crimes. His rule threatened to completely destabilize their brand-new colonial holdings. Ferdinand and Isabella were, frankly, deeply embarrassed.
Did they strip him of everything?
They revoked his titles as viceroy and governor permanently, but they still recognized his unique skill as a mariner, his genius for navigation. They eventually released him from prison, but they never gave him back his full administrative power.
So they needed his sailing skills, but not his leadership.
Exactly. And that necessity of relying on his navigation while stripping his political power is really the great paradox that defines the Fourth Voyage.
Right, the Fourth Voyage, 1502 to 1504. It's famous for that spectacular bit of, well, nautical showmanship that really underlines the skill you mentioned.
It's one of the great survival tales, isn't it? He was actually denied entry to the port of Santo Domingo by the new governor, Nicolas de Ovando.
Why?
Ovando didn't want him there. But Columbus, based on his experience and observations, predicted a massive hurricane was coming and warned Ovando not to sail.
Did Ovando listen?
No. He ignored the warning, sailed his fleet right into the storm, and lost about 20 out of 30 ships, including the one carrying a Bobadilla, Columbus's accuser, and a huge amount of gold destined for Spain. Columbus, meanwhile, had found shelter for his own ships and rode it out successfully.
Incredible vindication, in a way. And he used that kind of knowledge again later, didn't he, when he was stranded in Jamaica?
He did. A truly famous incident. He was stranded there for 6 months after his ships were too damaged to sail. His men were starting to starve because the local Arawak people, understandably, stopped supplying them with food.
So what did he do?
In desperation, he turned to his astronomical knowledge. He consulted almanacs, probably those compiled by Abraham Zacuto, and realized a total lunar eclipse was due on February 29th, 1504.
And he used it.
He told the Arawaks that his Christian God was angry with them for withholding food and was going to blot out the moon as a sign. When the eclipse started exactly as he predicted, the terrified Arawaks immediately resumed supplying his men.
Wow. A fantastic, if maybe cynical, example of his mastery of navigation mixed with pure survival instinct.
Absolutely. It shows both his knowledge and his pragmatism, maybe ruthlessness.
Okay, moving beyond the man's actual career now, let's turn to the legacy. His voyages kicked off what we now call the Columbian Exchange. It sounds quite benign, like a trade fair, but it carried catastrophic human costs.
The term itself refers to the massive transfer of plants, animals, technology, culture, and diseases between the Old World, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the New World, the Americas.
And while some exchanges were beneficial, corn, potatoes, tomatoes going to Europe, for instance.
Right, changing diets forever.
The exchange of pathogens was utterly devastating for the Americas. It led directly to this massive depopulation of the indigenous peoples.
It did, and we have to address the different views on what caused that massive death toll.
Right.
Was it purely disease, unavoidable tragedy? Or was it the brutality of the system he established? This is a really intense historical debate.
Let's start with the disease argument.
Okay. Scholars estimate that Old World diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza things, Europeans had some acquired immunity to over centuries, just ripped through Native American populations who had zero immunity. We're talking 80–90% fatality rates in some areas within the first century after contact.
Just staggering numbers.
Yeah. Charles C. Mann put it starkly. The suffering caused by these diseases in Eurasia over millennia was tragically concentrated into the span of decades in the New World. Disease was undeniably a major sweeping killer.
But other sources, other historians, make powerful arguments that it wasn't just disease, that the systemic violence, the forced labor, the terrible conditions and poor diets were equally, maybe even more, responsible for the rapid population collapse, especially in the Caribbean where Columbus's rule was most direct.
And this is where the nuance becomes absolutely essential. Historian Andres Reséndez, for instance, argues that while disease was certainly a factor, the evidence increasingly suggests that slavery has emerged as major killer of indigenous people in the Caribbean between 1492 and 1550.
How so? More than disease.
His argument is that under the encomienda system, natives forced into brutal labor, especially in gold and silver mines, experienced such extreme mortality rates, sometimes a third of the workforce dying every 6 months, that it completely shattered their societies. It prevented any chance of population recovery or developing immunity, unlike, say, European populations after the Black Death, which eventually rebounded. The relentless demand for labor essentially amounted to genocide by overwork.
And some historians don't shy away from using that word, genocide, when talking about this initial period under Columbus. Even Samuel Eliot Morison,
who was generally quite favorable towards Columbus in his biography.
Right. Even he wrote that the cruel policy initiated by Columbus and continued by his successors resulted in complete genocide on Hispaniola within just a few decades.
Which brings us back to the direct critique of his brutality, focusing not just on the accidental spread of disease, but on the intentional cruelty. Historians argue Columbus created a deliberate cycle of murder, violence, and slavery to maximize resource extraction. They see attributing the depopulation solely to disease as kind of letting the perpetrators off the hook, overlooking the human costs of the tribute system, the mutilations, the forced starvation.
And the sources are pretty unflinching, too, in documenting the personal cruelty within Columbus's circle. There's that horrifying account from his friend Michel de Cuneo.
Yes, describing the brutal sexual assault of an indigenous woman whom Columbus had captured and then essentially gave to Cuneo as a spoil of war. It's deeply disturbing and shows how this culture of violence permeated the command structure.
It really forces us to acknowledge these specific horrific acts that happened under his governorship. Now, we should probably mention the counter-arguments briefly. How do some historians try to contextualize or maybe dispute these accounts?
Well, some argue that accounts like those from Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a Dominican friar and a fierce critic of Spanish atrocities, might be exaggerated.
Why?
Possibly due to the Leyenda Negra, the Black Legend. This historical tendency, particularly among Northern European Protestant rivals of Spain, to paint Spanish actions, especially by Catholics, in the worst possible light for political reasons.
So the argument is the brutality might have been inflated for propaganda purposes?
That's one line of argument. Another defense suggests that Columbus's actions, like engaging in entrepreneurial slavery, merely reflected the accepted legal and moral standards of the 15th century, that he was simply a man of his time.
But does that hold up?
Even if you accept that legal context, and many historians challenge it, the sheer scale of the operation under Columbus and its devastating results are undeniable. Historians like Basil Davidson have pointed out that the systems Columbus established for enslaving indigenous people and the profits made heavily influenced the later development and justification of the much larger transatlantic African slave trade. He's even been dubbed the father of the slave trade by some for that reason.
Before we wrap up the legacy discussion, we absolutely have to address the whole idea of discovery itself, because the sources are clear. There was known prior European contact with the Americas.
Absolutely. The idea of Columbus as the first European discoverer has been thoroughly debunked by archaeological evidence. We know Norsemen, Vikings sailing from Greenland and Iceland, established a settlement temporary, but documented at Lancel Meadows in Newfoundland.
When was that?
Around 11 AD, nearly 500 years before Columbus sailed.
So in modern scholarship, you hear the event increasingly called an encounter, not a discovery. What's the significance of that shift in language?
It's a core philosophical debate, really. The Mexican philosopher Edmundo Gorman argued forcefully against the discovery myth, calling it a misleading legend, basically invented later by people like Washington Irving, who needed a non-British American origin story.
Why is discovery problematic?
Because it's inherently Eurocentric. It implies the land and its people didn't truly exist or matter until a European saw them. Encounter, on the other hand, is seen as a more neutral, universal term. It properly includes Native Americans in the narrative as active participants who are, already there with complex societies of their own.
We can't finish without touching on the bizarre story of his final resting place. It seems like a perfectly perplexing end to such an enigmatic life.
The mystery of the bones. It's fascinating. Columbus died in Valladolid, Spain in 1506. He was plagued by ill health in his later years, possibly reactive arthritis, gout, eye problems.
And his remains didn't stay put.
Not at all. They were moved repeatedly. First to a monastery in Seville. Then, fulfilling his own wish, they were shipped across the Atlantic to Santo Domingo in today's Dominican Republic.
Okay.
But then when France took over that part of Hispaniola in 1793, the Spanish authorities supposedly dug up the remains and moved them to Havana, Cuba, to keep them under Spanish control.
And then?
Then Cuba gained independence from Spain in 1898. And that's where the real confusion starts. At least some remains were shipped back across the Atlantic again, this time ending up in the Seville Cathedral.
Are those confirmed as his?
Pretty much. In 2003, DNA tests on those Seville remains confirmed a match with his brother Diego, whose remains were also there. So it's highly likely those are indeed Christopher Columbus's bones in Seville.
What?
But back in Santo Domingo, in the massive Columbus Lighthouse Monument, There's another lead box, discovered in the 19th century, inscribed, "Discoverer of America, First Admiral," containing remains claimed to be his.
Have those been tested?
No. The Dominican authorities have consistently refused to allow DNA testing on those remains. So the mystery persists. Is he buried in two continents? Or is one set of remains not actually his? We still don't know for sure.
It's almost fittingly complicated. And the evolution of how he's been commemorated, how he's remembered publicly, that's maybe the clearest sign of his changing historical status, isn't it?
Absolutely. In the 18th and especially the 19th century, he became this huge unifying symbol, particularly in the United States.
Why the U.S. specifically?
They were actively looking for a founding myth figure who wasn't British. Columbus fit the bill. His name became the basis for the national personification, Columbia. Think District of Columbia, Columbia University.
Right.
The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, celebrating the 400th anniversary, was a massive event. Stamps, coins featuring him. It really cemented his image as this inspirational hero who conquered the impossible.
That reverence lasted a long time, but it started to shift significantly, didn't it? As modern critiques focus more on the human cost.
Exactly. Really starting around the 500th anniversary in 1992, and then accelerating dramatically in recent years, the narrative shifted. More focus on him as an agent of genocide, environmental destruction, the start of colonial exploitation.
And we've seen the results of that shift very publicly.
We have. The sources note that following major protests, civil unrest, particularly in the U.S., but elsewhere too, many public monuments to Christopher Columbus have been removed, either officially or torn down by protesters. It reflects this fundamental public rethinking of who we choose to celebrate from our past and how we acknowledge figures who are pivotal but also deeply, tragically flawed.
So this whole deep dive really brings us right back to that central contradiction we started with. Christopher Columbus. Intensely ambitious, undeniably a brilliant mariner in many ways.
Whose fatal miscalculations about geography, ironically, led him to one of the most significant moments in human history.
But also one of the most tragic. Connecting two worlds, yes, but with truly overwhelming, devastating consequences for one of them.
What really stands out, I think, is that we're left with this almost impossible task of judging him across centuries. You have the sheer skill, the ambition, the drive of this self-taught explorer who mastered the Atlantic winds.
And on the other hand,
the cold, documented brutality of the colonial governor who oversaw forced labor, horrific mutilations, mass enslavement, and contributed directly to the decimation of entire peoples.
So where does that leave us today? What does this all mean for you listening now? How do we balance that? The ambition, the skill, the undeniable world-altering impact with the documented brutality, the mismanagement, the catastrophic human cost.
What happens when the hero and the villain are clearly, demonstrably the same man? And how does really understanding that complexity change the way we think about, maybe commemorate, the history that brought us to where we are now?
That's the question, isn't it? The one we have to keep grappling with long after this deep dive ends.